Anaya Patel woke to the sound of her phone alarm. Another reminder that she had only 3 weeks left before her student visa expired. For most 23-year-olds, mornings began with thoughts of exams, friendships, or weekend plans. But for her, every sunrise carried the weight of a deadline she couldn't escape. She had come to America with a dream her family back in Mumbai had carried for her since she was a child: to study, to build, to succeed in a country that promised boundless opportunity. She believed if she worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, she could change not just her life but the future of those she loved. But that morning, as she sat on the edge of her narrow dorm bed, staring at the crumpled notice from Immigration Services, the dream felt fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table, one wrong move away from shattering. Without renewal, her status, her education, and the sacrifices her parents had made would all collapse in an instant. She whispered a quiet prayer, pressing her palms together the way her mother had taught her. She thought of the long hours her father spent driving a rickshaw through the crowded streets of Mumbai, saving every rupee so she could sit here now, in this small American apartment, clutching papers that decided her fate. That morning was supposed to be about deadlines, paperwork, and classes. Yet what she could never have imagined was that outside her door, forces far more dangerous than expired documents were already moving toward her. Her life was about to take a turn she couldn't prepare for, because while she worried about visas and grades, someone else had been watching. Welcome to Evil Crime Cases. Thanks for subscribing to our channel. Please like and share our videos, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comment section. Now, let's get back to the details of the case. She arrived in America with 2 suitcases, a pocket full of hopes, and the weight of an entire family's expectations pressing down on her shoulders. Anaya Patel was 23, the eldest daughter of a middle-class family in India who had sold a piece of ancestral land just to send her overseas. Her parents reminded her constantly, "This is not only your dream, it is ours too." In the quiet hours of night, while the city of Philadelphia pulsed outside her small studio apartment, Anaya would sit at her desk surrounded by textbooks and scribbled notes. On the wall hung a single photo, her parents, standing proudly in front of their modest home. Every time she looked at it, she felt both pride and a deepening fear. Because her future in America was balanced on something fragile, a student visa. Without it, all her dreams, medicine, a career, the chance to lift her family into a different life, would vanish. That fear became real in the spring of 2019. Renewal papers delayed, emails unanswered, bureaucracy that didn't care about the girl who studied until dawn. She swallowed her panic during lectures, but each night ended the same way, staring at her laptop screen, praying for one confirmation email that never came. And when her phone rang late at night, her mother's voice thick with hope, Anaya lied. She told them things were fine, that everything was on track. Because how could she admit that the foundation of their sacrifice was cracking beneath her feet? It was during this time of quiet desperation that she first noticed Malcolm. He wasn't the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention. Instead, he carried himself like someone who had already lived 2 lives before turning 27. Broad shoulders from long shifts in a warehouse, tired eyes from law school at night, and yet a warmth that disarmed her. When he laughed, it wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the sound of someone who refused a break, no matter how heavy the world pressed down. They met in the campus library. She was clutching a rejection letter from her immigration attorney when Malcolm leaned over the table and said softly, "You look like you just lost the war." For the first time in weeks, she smiled. To Anaya, Malcolm was more than a friend. He was proof that someone else understood what it meant to fight for survival in America. And in those long evenings together, her stories of home, his confessions about bills piling up, an unlikely bond began to take shape. But when 2 people meet in desperation, what grows between them is rarely simple. Was it comfort? Was it love? Or was it the start of something that neither of them, in that quiet library corner, could truly see coming? By the time the semester neared its end, Anaya's smile no longer reached her eyes. Her friends in Maryland noticed the change. She was still the vibrant young woman who filled a room with laughter, but when she thought no one was looking, her face betrayed a private storm. Letters from the immigration office sat unopened in her bag. Deadlines for her student visa crept closer, and with each passing day, the walls around her future seemed to close in. For Anaya, deportation was not just about leaving America. It meant going back to a life she believed she had escaped, returning to family expectations in India that weighed on her shoulders since girlhood. The thought of losing her place in this country, her chance to build something new, kept her awake at night. Malcolm, meanwhile, was caught between two worlds. By day, he studied case law, trained to understand the difference between right and wrong. By night, he watched his mother's strength fade as illness took its toll. He carried both burdens quietly, one eye on the law books, the other on the hospital bills piling at home. It was in this fragile space that Anaya began to press. At first, her words were framed as half-jokes. "We could solve everything if you married me," she would laugh, then fall silent, letting the idea linger in the air longer than a joke should. When Malcolm frowned, she quickly softened, promising it was only desperation talking. But her desperation never left. As weeks passed, her hints sharpened. She painted pictures of a shared future, a life where her dreams were secure and Malcolm's family was cared for. She reminded him that love wasn't just about passion. It was about sacrifice. "Would you really let me be sent away?" she whispered one evening, knowing you had the power to stop it. Malcolm resisted. He told himself marriage was sacred, not a tool. He told her it was fraud, that a law student of all people couldn't afford to play with fire. Yet even as he said the words, his mother's face came to him, the fragile grip of her hand, the quiet plea in her eyes for stability, for peace. He carried guilt like a shadow, the kind that grows heavier the more you try to outrun it. Anaya, sensing his hesitation, leaned harder. She promised that the arrangement was only on paper, that nothing had to change between them, except her security. She swore that this was not manipulation, but love's test. And slowly, Malcolm's defenses crumbled, not from Anaya's words alone, but from the relentless collision of his mother's illness, his financial strain, and his own fear of losing her. The wedding itself was small, almost invisible to the outside world. A courthouse ceremony, no church bells, no family gathered in rows. Just a few signatures, a worn folder, and two young people binding themselves with promises neither fully believed. On paper, it was official. To Anaya, it was salvation. To Malcolm, it was surrender. But marriage built on desperation carries its own price. Every choice has a shadow, and this one was already stretching far longer than either of them could see. And the haunting question remains, when love and legality are forced into a bargain, which one survives? Anaya moved through each day with the elegance of someone who had learned how to hide. On the surface, she was Malcolm's young wife, careful with her manners, precise in how she spoke at gatherings, and always ready with the smile people expected of a newlywed. But beneath that polish lived a secret she guarded with more devotion than her vows. The life she still shared with Rajiv, her fiancé, waiting oceans away in India. The deception did not unfold in grand gestures. It lived in the smallest corners of her existence. A phone that never left her palm, texts written late into the night, the glow of the screen reflecting against her face while Malcolm slept beside her. Conversations whispered in Hindi, soft enough to blur meaning, yet carrying an intimacy that language alone could not disguise. When asked by neighbors how she was adjusting, Anaya answered warmly, her words smooth and convincing. Yet behind closed doors, guilt and desire wrestled with duty. In the quiet of her own thoughts, she told herself this wasn't betrayal, it was transition. She owed Rajiv loyalty, she told herself. He had waited years while their families arranged a future. She owed him, even as Malcolm provided her the life Rajiv never could. Malcolm, meanwhile, felt the weight of something unsaid pressing into the walls of their home. At first, it was small things, The way Anaya would turn her body when her phone vibrated, shielding the screen. The way she lingered at the edge of their bed, smiling at something unseen before quickly dimming her expression when she realized he was watching. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that the insecurity was his, not hers. But unease has a way of sharpening the senses. On one evening, the first seed of suspicion took root. They were sitting in silence, Malcolm reading a contract, Anaya scrolling through her phone. Her lips parted, just slightly, and she let out a laugh, low, tender, private. A laugh Malcolm had never heard directed at him. When he looked up, she froze. And in that pause, in that flicker of fear across her face, he felt the first sting of betrayal. Rajiv's presence grew louder in their household without ever stepping inside. Anaya began slipping away for errands that lasted hours. She changed how she dressed, putting care into her appearance when she claimed she was only meeting study friends. Malcolm noticed the perfume, the subtle red on her lips, details that seemed meant for someone else's eyes. And still, he said nothing. Instead, he watched. He waited. And each day, the silence between them swelled until it was heavier than words. The breaking point came not through confrontation, but through accident. Late one night, Anaya fell asleep with her phone still in her hand. Malcolm, restless and unable to quiet the gnawing questions, reached for it. His fingers hesitated over the glowing screen, heart pounding as though he were the one committing a betrayal. Then it vibrated. A call. A name lit up the screen. Rajiv. Malcolm's breath caught in his throat. He pressed accept. A voice spilled through the receiver, warm and unguarded. My love, I miss you. Did you tell him yet? The words hung in the darkness, sharp as glass, slicing through every illusion Malcolm had fought to maintain. In that moment, the home he thought he had built with Anaya collapsed around him, though not a single wall had moved. Rajiv grew up in a small apartment above his father's textile shop in Ahmedabad. To neighbors, he was the golden son, disciplined, ambitious, never late for temple or school. But beneath the neat haircuts and crisp shirts lay a boy who believed the world owed him obedience. Teachers admired his intelligence, but classmates complained about his temper. A cricket match gone wrong. A classmate who walked away with a broken lip. Little things, they said, but little things had a way of becoming patterns. By the time he reached his 20s, Rajiv's life was measured by two obsessions: achievement and Anaya. She had been his classmate, his friend, his confidant. In his mind, his future wife. When she smiled at him, he saw possession, not affection. When she confided her worries, he heard promises she never made. So when word reached him that Anaya had married Malcolm, a foreigner, an outsider, Rajiv's pride curdled into humiliation. For Rajiv, love was never a matter of choice. It was a contract he believed had already been signed. And now, in his eyes, it had been broken. He told his family he wanted to pursue higher studies in America. He filled out visa papers, collected documents, rehearsed every line before the embassy officer. But the real reason, buried in silence, was simple. If Anaya had crossed an ocean, then so would he. The first night Rajiv landed in Maryland, he stood outside a student hostel, suitcase at his feet, staring at the city lights. But his thoughts weren't on new beginnings. They were circling back to Anaya, her laughter, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the life she was now building with another man. From the start, his classes were secondary. The late-night library visits, the endless phone calls to relatives back home, these were nothing but camouflage. His real studies were of Anaya's routines. He learned the grocery store she favored. He noted Malcolm's office hours. Slowly, he inserted himself into the periphery of her life, until his presence became impossible to ignore. For Malcolm, the cracks began to appear like hairline fractures in glass. At first, it was a passing mention, Anaya saying, "I ran into Rajiv at the market." Then another time, "He helped me fix my car." A coincidence here, a favor there. But for Malcolm, each mention felt like a sting. Who was this man who seemed to know so much about his wife? Why was he always near? The more Malcolm looked, the more he saw the shadow of another man tracing the edges of his marriage. He tried to dismiss it, but doubt has a way of feeding on silence. And silence was exactly what grew between him and Anaya. Rajiv, meanwhile, thrived in that silence. He played the role of confidant, patient listener, the man who asked the questions Malcolm no longer voiced. He didn't need to press Anaya for affection. He only needed to wait while her husband's insecurities did the work for him. By the time Malcolm realized that Rajiv wasn't simply a friend from the past, but a rival determined to claim his place, it was already too late. And the question that now hung in the air was no longer about love at all. It was about pride, about humiliation. When a man feels replaced in his own home, what does he become capable of? Malcolm had always believed betrayal was something that lived in the headlines, other people's tragedies, distant and abstract. But in the months that followed, betrayal became his daily companion. He was no longer a husband searching for reasons. He was a man cataloging evidence. In the quiet of his home office, the blinds always half closed, Malcolm began assembling a private archive. It started with receipts and bank statements that didn't add up, but soon it grew into something much larger, an obsessive collection of articles, immigration cases, federal indictments against couples who had treated marriage like currency. He scoured late-night message boards where people confessed how they had used love as a mask to secure residency or money. Every story seemed to echo his own life. Every confession felt like a mirror held to Anaya. His journal became a running autopsy of his marriage. Each page documented not just facts, but feelings, sleepless nights, an unease that stretched into paranoia, questions that circled endlessly. He described waking up at 3 a.m., replaying every conversation they had ever had, searching for hidden codes in her words. He wrote of how the smell of her perfume no longer lingered sweetly, but carried the weight of deceit. The toll was visible. He lost weight. And while Malcolm retreated into his shadows, Anaya seemed to shine more brightly. Friends noticed she grew bolder in her spending, careless with her stories, less cautious about contradictions in her explanations. She dismissed Malcolm's questions with laughter that felt rehearsed, with reassurances too slick to be genuine. Confidence had made her reckless. Her world of deception had grown too wide, too tangled, and in that expansion she left gaps. A document misfiled, a phone call taken too loudly, a trail that led back to something she had tried to bury. Malcolm noticed all of it. For him, this was no longer just suspicion, it was confirmation. Every careless slip on her part became a nail in the coffin of trust. And yet, instead of confronting her immediately, Malcolm chose patience. He let her mistake ripen. He watched. He prepared. Because Malcolm understood something Anaya had overlooked. Webs are not only spun to trap others. Sometimes, they collapse on the very person who weaves them. And in the weeks ahead, Anaya would make the mistake that did not simply betray her game. She would reveal the truth Malcolm had been waiting for. For weeks, Rajiv and Anaya had rehearsed their lies with precision. They thought they were careful, stolen glances at odd hours, whispered calls when the house was quiet, secret exchanges under the pretense of work or errands. But lies have a way of decaying under pressure, and cracks have begun to form. Their fights no longer waited for privacy. They erupted in living rooms, spilled across phone lines, sometimes with Malcolm standing silently in the next room, listening, memorizing every word. Rajiv's voice, sharp and unrelenting, carried the tone of a man who thought control was slipping from his hands. You told me he wouldn't suspect anything, Anaya. But I can feel him watching. You think Malcolm is a fool. He's not. He sees more than you think. Anaya, her voice laced with exhaustion, would snap back. You don't know him the way I do. He doesn't question. He trusts too much. You're imagining things, Rajiv. But her words betrayed her. There was a hesitation, a doubt. And Malcolm, just out of sight, heard that hesitation like a blade pressing into his skin. Malcolm had already shifted from confusion to calculation. At first, he told himself he needed proof. Something undeniable. Something no one could twist. So he began recording. A small device, hidden in his jacket pocket, tucked into the cushions of the couch, slipped under the table when he left the room. Every argument between Rajiv and Anaya became evidence. Every insult, every accusation, every slip of the tongue was captured. When Rajiv shouted, "You still love him, don't you? That's why you won't leave." The tape preserved it, cold and final. But somewhere along the line, Malcolm's motive shifted. He wasn't just collecting proof for a lawyer. He wasn't building a case for divorce. He was creating a ledger of betrayal, a growing archive of wounds he would one day answer for. It was Malcolm's mother who saw it first. She came by one evening, bringing food, as mothers do. She studied her son's face, the dark circles under his eyes, the clenched jaw, the silence that stretched too long. She had lived long enough to recognize a man slipping into obsession. Sitting across from him, she placed her hand on his. "Son," she said softly, "you're drowning in a lie. I can see it in you. Whatever you think you're building here, it won't save you. It will destroy you." Malcolm didn't answer. He only nodded, eyes fixed on the table, while the recordings played over and over in his mind. He wasn't drowning. He was sinking willingly, letting the weight pull him deeper. To outsiders, the marriage looked intact. Malcolm still wore his ring. Anaya still smiled at church gatherings. They still attended dinners, sat across from friends, told jokes that sounded rehearsed but convincing. The mask was still there, but inside the home, it was cracked, splintering, ready to shatter. And in Malcolm's private world, the decision was already taking form. Divorce was too neat, too civilized for what he was enduring. The recordings weren't preparation for a courtroom. They were preparation for something else, something darker, heavier, irreversible. Malcolm immersed himself in the shadows of other men's mistakes. He read late into the night. Not novels, but archived court cases, online forums where anonymous users dissected perfect crimes, and true crime articles about husbands and wives who vanished without a trace. He studied what they did wrong. One left receipts. Another confided in a friend. Another bought fuel with a credit card. Malcolm took notes in a small black notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress, jotting down lessons like commandments. Never trust anyone. Never leave a trail. Always have two exits. To those who knew him, Malcolm seemed fine. He still smiled at coworkers, still checked in with his sisters, still posted cheerful photos on social media. But behind that mask, paranoia had become his second skin. He switched cell phones every few weeks, buying prepaid burners from corner stores and discarding the old ones in dumpsters far from his neighborhood. He changed his jogging routes daily, sometimes circling blocks just to make sure no one was following him. When neighbors waved, he waved back with a grin. They couldn't see the storm building inside. The deeper he slipped into planning, the more he convinced himself that this wasn't madness, it was balance. In his mind, Anaya hadn't just broken vows. She had humiliated him, stripped him of dignity. Her betrayal was a wound, and revenge was the medicine. Small choices marked his descent. At the hardware store, he lingered by the aisles of rope, locks, and accelerants. He memorized the labels, paid cash for what he bought, and mixed his purchases with ordinary items: light bulbs, batteries, cleaning supplies. To anyone else, it was just a bag of housework. To Malcolm, it was preparation. At night, he practiced lies in the mirror, rehearsing alibis in the same steady voice he once used to recite wedding vows. He deleted his browser history daily. He created coded reminders on sticky notes. Meeting at 8 really meant check her routine. Drop off meant dispose of supplies. The man who once dreamed of a family vacation, of Sunday barbecues and laughter in the yard, was gone. What remained was someone sharper, more dangerous, someone who believed the only way to regain control of his life was to destroy the one who had taken it from him. And then, one night, Malcolm stopped researching and started acting. He slipped on gloves, opened his notebook, and placed a single check mark next to a phrase written in bold ink: test run. That night, a small abandoned shed outside the city went up in flames. No one connected it to him. No one even knew he was there. But Malcolm knew, and to him, It was proof that his plan could work. The question was no longer if he would move against Anaya. The question was when. The night of the fire was not loud at first. In fact, it began with an almost ordinary quiet, a silence that pressed against the walls of the narrow apartment like something waiting to be broken. Inside, Anaya sat at the edge of the couch, her voice lowered to a whisper. Rajiv stood over her, pacing, his words sharp, demanding. He accused her of betrayal. He pressed her about loyalty, about family, about the years he claimed to have given up for her. His hands moved wildly, cutting the air, pointing, jabbing, never striking, but threatening enough that each gesture seemed like it could be the one. Anaya's replies were fragmented. Her tone trembled between guilt and defiance. She tried to reason with him, but her eyes darted toward the door again and again, as if expecting someone, or fearing someone. Then came the knock. A single, deliberate knock. When the door opened, Malcolm stepped in. Not shouting, not rushing. Calm, controlled. His stillness made him more threatening than Rajiv's frenzy. He did not speak right away, only stood in the doorway, letting the sight of him hang heavy in the room. Rajiv turned instantly, his voice rising. He demanded Malcolm leave. He accused him of destroying his home, poisoning his marriage. The words spilled out like gasoline. Malcolm's reply was a whisper, measured low. He said he came only for clarity. His tone was steady, but his eyes burned with something else. Possession, perhaps, or inevitability. The argument sharpened. Anaya, caught between them, tried to mediate, her voice cracking as she pleaded for calm. But the more she spoke, the more each man pulled at her, as though she were a prize neither could afford to lose. What happened next will forever remain uncertain. Some neighbors later said they heard shouting, then a crash, glass shattering, something heavy overturning. Others swore they smelled kerosene before the flames. What is known as this? At some point, the chaos turned to smoke. A flicker at first, crawling along the floorboards. Then the choking stench, the crackle of wood splintering. Heat surged into the narrow apartment, and panic split the night open. Rajiv's voice was heard yelling. Some say calling for help. Others say cursing Malcolm's name. Anaya's screams were sharper, desperate, swallowed by the rising roar of fire. By the time neighbors spilled into the hallway, flames had already licked through the windows, glowing orange against the sky. They banged on doors, shouting for anyone inside to escape. The air filled with smoke so thick it drove back even the bravest. When firefighters forced their way through the collapsing frame, only one body was found, charred beyond recognition, yet later identified as Rajiv. Anaya was gone. Malcolm, too. The blaze was ruled suspicious, though no accelerant was ever conclusively found. To some, it looked like a lover's quarrel turned deadly accident. To others, it bore the hallmarks of something calculated, a final act of possession carried out in fire. And in that silence after the flames, a question lingered heavier than the smoke itself. Was this the night Malcolm's plan came to completion, or the night he finally lost control? The first hours after the fire were chaos. Sirens still echoed in the neighborhood. The acrid stench of smoke clung to the air, and officers moved like shadows through the wreckage. Rajiv's family pressed investigators for answers. Where was Anaya? Had she burned in the blaze? Or had she slipped away into the night? The questions only deepened as fragments of evidence began to surface. Malcolm, remarkably unscathed, was captured on surveillance less than 2 hours after the fire. The footage shows him strolling into a corner store. His gait is measured, his clothes clean. He buys a bottle of water and a packet of gum. He does not cough, does not limp, does not look like a man who has just survived an inferno. Detectives would later freeze-frame the footage, dissecting his posture, the way his hands rested calmly on the counter, the way his eyes never met the clerk's. To them, it was the portrait of composure, too much composure. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, witnesses reported something else. A truck driver heading down the interstate swore he saw a woman darting across the grass shoulder near midnight, barefoot, her white shirt torn, hair whipping against her face. Another motorist described slowing down as a figure stumbled toward the highway ramp, arms flailing as if waving for help. She vanished into the darkness before anyone could stop. Investigators canvassed the area. Dogs were deployed, sweeping ditches and wooded stretches along the road. They found nothing. No footprints that could hold against the rain that fell hours later. No discarded belongings. No trace of blood. And so the competing images collided. Malcolm coolly buying gum, while somewhere, perhaps, Anaya was running for her life. For Rajiv's grieving relatives, the uncertainty was unbearable. His mother asked detectives the same question over and over. If she escaped, why didn't she come home? Why didn't she call? Each day, without an answer, hardened suspicion. Was Anaya hiding out of guilt? Or was she silenced before she could reach safety? Detectives pulled every scrap of information they could, checking hospitals for unidentified patients, cross-referencing bus station footage, combing through motels for a woman checking in alone. Every lead went nowhere. One theory began to grow. What if Anaya had been alive that night, running barefoot along the highway, but someone else intercepted her before she could tell her story? By the end of that week, the vanishing had become the defining riddle of the case. A burned house, a dead husband, a survivor who had walked away too calmly, and a woman who, if she lived, had vanished as though the earth swallowed her whole. The silence in Malcolm's home grew heavier after the fire. Walls that once echoed with Anaya's laughter now stood like mute witnesses, absorbing his footsteps, his muttering, his long stares at empty chairs. Betrayal had left behind more than loss. It had hollowed him out and filled that space with something far darker. Neighbors would later recall seeing him sitting on the porch at odd hours, rocking gently, eyes fixed on nothing. Sometimes he whispered under his breath. One man said he could make out the words, "No one makes a fool out of me." Another swore he heard him laugh at shadows. But the truth was this: Malcolm was living among ghosts. The memory of Anaya's deception was stitched into his every thought. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, her smile, her warmth, turning away from him and toward someone else. To Malcolm, betrayal was not just infidelity. It was humiliation. It was being stripped bare in front of his community. It was being branded a man who could not protect his home. And humiliation, in his world, was worse than death. Psychologists studying cases like Malcolm's often describe betrayal as a weapon more devastating than violence itself. When love is corrupted, when the trust that binds two souls is weaponized against one of them, the wound becomes unbearable. For some, the instinct is to retreat, to walk away. For others, like Malcolm, it festers into obsession, where revenge feels less like choice and more like justice. We see this same thread in other tragedies. In Atlanta, a father poisoned his wife's lover after discovering years of secret meetings. In Chicago, a man burned down his own business when he found out his partner had taken both his money and his wife. In case after case, humiliation turns to fury, and fury, left unchecked, becomes destruction. Malcolm's destruction began inward. He stopped eating meals at the table. He stopped speaking to his sisters on the phone. Nights became sleepless cycles of pacing, muttering, and replaying every scene with Anaya in his head. Her smile the day she said she loved him, the strange softness in her voice when she said she was going out, the lingering perfume on her clothes when she returned. The cultural clash deepened his torment. In his world, loyalty was sacred. Marriage was not just a bond between two people, but between families, between histories. To be cast aside, to be made a fool of, especially by someone who vowed faithfulness before God, was to be erased as a man. Inside Malcolm's journal, police would later find scribbled notes. If they laugh at me, they laugh forever. Justice is mine. The fire was only the beginning. The notes were dated after the fire, proof that the act had not cleansed him. It had only deepened his hunger. He was a man who thought revenge would end the pain, but instead found that pain had many layers, and each one demanded a new answer. By this stage, Malcolm was no longer seen as the quiet, reserved man who once built birdhouses for children in the neighborhood. People crossed the street to avoid him. His muttering grew louder. His eyes darted as though unseen figures followed him. A former co-worker said, "He carried something on his back, like a shadow he couldn't shake off." And perhaps that shadow was Anaya herself, the image of her betrayal, her laughter with another man, replaying endlessly in his mind. The tragedy of Malcolm's psyche is that he never asked the right question. He never wondered how to heal. He only wondered how to strike back harder, how to balance a scale that could never truly be balanced. And so the question lingers for us, the audience. When love is turned against you, when betrayal cuts to the bone, do you walk away with your dignity intact, or do you let the ghosts of the past decide your fate?